Welcome to What's Bothering Rashi, Parsha's Emor Tafshin Peivav. This week's Parsha begins with the laws of Kohanim. Kohanim have to make sure they don't become tameh, they don't get close to a dead body, they don't go into a cemetery. We'll learn together Rashi on the first pasuk. The Parsha begins, Vayomer Hashem and Moshe. Hashem tells Moshe, Emor el Kohanim, say to the Kohanim, Bnei Aaron, the sons of Aaron, V'amarta alehem, and you should say to them, Lenefesh lo itama be'amav. Make sure you don't become tameh. Says Rashi, Emor el Kohanim, Emor ve'amarta, le'azhir gedolim al aktanim. There's something unique when it comes to Kohanim. Not only do they have to make sure that they don't become tameh, but they have to warn and make sure the ktanim, the minors, the younger children, less than bar mitzvah, babies, they have to make sure they don't become tameh either. Bnei Aaron, yachol chalalim. I would have thought that a halal also has this obligation to make sure he's pure. A halal is a kohen who was married after his father married someone he shouldn't. For example, a kohen who marries a divorced woman, he's not allowed to. The child that's born from that marriage is called a halal, and he cannot work in the Beit HaMikdash. So, Bnei Aaron, says Rashi, Yachol Chalalim, I would have thought also a halal kohen still has to make sure he doesn't go into a cemetery. Tamud Lomar Kohanim, no, only the Kohanim, the ones who literally practice kahuna, they're the ones who are obligated. But a halal, who isn't a kohen, he can't work in the Beit HaMikdash as a kohen, he could become tameh. So let's start with the first part of Rashi. Emor el Kohanim. What's bothering Rashi? Rashi helps us this time, and he hints to what's bothering him in the first two words. Emor ve'amalta. There's a double expression in the pasuk. The pasuk says, Emor el Kohanim, say to the Kohanim, Bnei Aaron, and then again, and say to them. That's extra. Why does it have to say again? And you should say to them. It says already, say to the Kohanim. So from here, Rashi says, we learn that the Kohanim have to make sure their younger children also keep these halachot of Tum'ah v'Tahara. And it's very nice because now it changes the meaning of the pasuk, right? Emor v'amarta, the two words say, are not talking about the same people. The first time Hashem is telling Moshe, say to the Kohanim. The second time, V'amarta aleim, is Moshe Rabbeinu speaking to the Kohanim and telling them, V'amarta aleim, you Kohen, you should say to them, to your children, make sure your children also know and don't become tameh. So that's the first Rashi, that is what was bothering him, and now we have a nice new meaning in the pasuk. But I want to ask another question, which is a basic question to ask. And when you learn Rashi, Rashi will always explain it and it makes sense. He'll explain the pasuk in the order of the words in the pasuk. He'll explain the first word first, the second word, the third word. If we find a Rashi that explains the last word first, and then he explains the first word, we have a question. And we have to understand why. And this is a question we can ask in this pasuk also. Because as we said, the first Rashi is explaining the word Emor ve'amarta. So the question begins when you get to the word ve'amarta aleim. The next Rashi is Bnei Aaron HaKohanim. And that appears in the pasuk before the word ve'amarta. So Rashi should have explained first HaKohanim Bnei Aaron, and then explained ve'amarta is referring to the Kohanim making sure their children also don't become tameh. Why does Rashi change the order? Why does he first explain the word ve'amarta, and then he explains Bnei Aaron HaKohanim to teach you that a halal kohen doesn't have the obligations of Tum'ah v'Tahara? So this is a question many of Mefarshei Rashi ask. Today we'll learn one of the Mefarshim called Seder L'Derech. Seder L'Derech was written by Rabbi Sachar Ber Eilenberg. He was born in 1550 in Poland, and I think this Sefer was printed in Prague. I think eventually he was in Prague. And he wrote another Sefer called Be'er Sheva, which is on the Gemaras. But he wrote Seder L'Derech explaining Rashi. And he asks this question, why does Rashi change the order when he comes to explain this pasuk? And he says a beautiful answer. And his answer is based on a Rosh. The Rosh is one of the Rishonim, one of the early commentators. And the Rosh says the same halakha, that the older Kohanim have to make sure their children also don't become tameh. But he doesn't learn it out like Rashi from the words of Emor v'amarta. He learns it out from the words HaKohanim b'nei Aaron. And he says usually we find when we have these three words, it's b'nei Aaron, HaKohanim, which makes more sense. First, b'nei Aaron, who are they? The Kohanim. In our pasuk, we change the order. HaKohanim b'nei Aaron. Says the Rosh, you know why we change the order? Because HaKohanim have to make sure that b'nei Aaron, that the younger children, also don't become tameh. So he learns out the same thing Rashi learns, but he learns it out from different words in the pasuk. But with that, the Tzedel HaDerech explains Rashi. Because Rashi read the pasuk, and when you read HaKohanim b'nei Aaron, and you ask yourself, why do we change the order? What are we learning out from these words? And you could say like the Rosh, we learn out from here that the Kohanim have to teach their young children also to keep themselves pure. But then Rashi got to the word V'omartu aleim. And now he has a problem. V'omartu aleim, why does it say it again? So Rashi says V'omartu aleim is written again because from here we learn out that the Kohanim have to make sure their children don't become tameh. But now that Rashi explained, we learn it out from V'amarta, now he has to go back to the words before, HaKohanim b'nei Aaron, and he asks himself, what do we learn from this? Now that I learn that the Kohanim have to make sure their children aren't tameh from the word V'amarta, the second time it says V'amarta, so now a question is created. What do we learn out from the previous words, HaKohanim b'nei Aaron? And therefore Rashi now, after he explained the words V'amartu aleim, he goes back to explain what do we learn out from HaKohanim b'nei Aaron? And he says, you know what we learn out? We learn out something else. We don't learn out that the Kohanim have to tell their children, have to make sure their children keep themselves pure. We learn out something else. From the word HaKohanim, we learn out that only a Kohen who's practicing as a Kohen has these obligations of Tumah v'Taira, but a Halal doesn't. And then he explains what the words B'nei Aaron are teaching us, and he says it's excluding B'nos Aaron, which means a girl, a woman who is a Kohen from a Kohen family, she is allowed to go into a cemetery. But now we understand why Rashi explained the words in the order he explains them. So we understood what was bothering Rashi. And we also now understand why he changed the order of the words when he explains the pasuk. Have a wonderful Shabbos.